On an official North Korean cell phone, they piece them together. There you go, you have a conversation. It costs about 500,000 South Korean won to do that. That's about $500 for about an hour. For an international NGO to effectively work on a specific context, it is absolutely critical to have in-country contacts, to be in touch with dissidents, for example, human rights groups inside the country. What makes North Korea, the DPRK, different is that there is practically no civil society inside the country. So we work with North Korean dissident groups, North Korean human rights groups outside the country, many of them based in South Korea. Of course, they're also the ones who grant access inside the country. In a nutshell, what are we dealing with? Well, we have witnessed more than a year of summit diplomacy, 3 meetings between President Moon Jae-in of South Korea and Kim Jong-un, the leader of North Korea, 2 meetings between President Trump and Kim Jong-un in Singapore on the 12th of June last year, and then again in Hanoi in Vietnam in February of this year. We have seen multiple meetings between the leader of China, President Xi Jinping, and Kim Jong-un, and of course Kim Jong-un is just now meeting with Vladimir Putin, the Russian leader. So despite this flurry of diplomacy, the actual situation on the ground has not changed. In February 2014, a UN Commission of Inquiry published its report after a year-long investigation, finding that many of the egregious human rights violations happening in North Korea, especially egregious human rights violations being perpetrated at North Korea's political prison camps, amount to crimes against humanity. So we are dealing basically with a regime that is still running 6 political prison camps where 120,000 men, women, and children are held. Why men, women, and children? Because the regime applies a system of guilt by association called Yeonjae in Korean. Up to 3 generations of the same family are punished for the perceived wrongdoings of one particular individual. Very uniquely so, North Korea has a system of loyalty-based social classification. According to one's file, the system is called Songbun. According to one's Songbun file, according to the perceived level of loyalty to the supreme leader, according to the family's level of loyalty, perceived level of loyalty to the supreme leader, individuals are classified into core class, 20 to 25% of the population, wavering class, 40 to 60% of the population, hostile class, 20 to 25% of the population. Of course, the regime's top strategic objective is survival. Well, at first glance, there's nothing wrong with that, right? Any political system thrives to survive. But in this particular case, we're actually dealing with a regime that is committing crimes against humanity. We're dealing with a regime that has survived its peers in Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union by 30 years now. The year is 2019. And a regime that has accomplished 2 hereditary transmissions of power in the process, from grandfather Kim Il-sung to son Kim Jong-il in July 1994, from son Kim Jong-il to grandson Kim Jong-un in December 2011. It's a regime that has survived through focusing most available resources on the areas that it regards as critical to its survival: nuclear weapons, ballistic missiles, the military, and keeping the top elites happy by granting them access to luxury goods from the outside world. North Korea, of course, is currently under a UN sanctions regime. You'll see that, by the way, I mentioned the UPR process. The DPRK government claims that the dire humanitarian situation of North Korea has been caused by the sanctions regime. Nothing could be further from the truth. the sanctions regime does not target the people of North Korea. The sanctions regime has two goals in mind. Number one, to prevent the development and proliferation of North Korean nuclear weapons and ballistic missiles. Number two, to punish the elites in charge of that development and proliferation by severing their access to luxury goods from the outside world. So, if one thinks of the sanctions regime, you could say that on the contrary, due to the sanctions regime, the North Korean population may actually have better access to food, for example. Seafood is one of the items included now in the sanctions regime. The exportation of seafood from North Korea is banned pursuant to the UN sanctions regime. On the surface, China, Russia, other neighboring countries will report that they are enforcing the sanctions regime. It's a very complex situation. There are individual operators, smaller operators that continue the cross-border trade, actually. So, what is the problem with summit diplomacy? Well, there's no problem with diplomacy. I believe that all of us are in favor of diplomacy of any kind. But the problem with North Korean diplomacy is that from the viewpoint of the United States, from the viewpoint of the United Nations, from the viewpoint of the international community, of course, the goal is CVID, complete, verifiable, irreversible denuclearization of North Korea. Secretary Pompeo actually refers to this issue, has coined it a little bit differently. It's now FFVD, full, final, verifiable denuclearization of North Korea. Same thing. So what do you need in order to verify? Well, in order to verify, you need a declaration of capabilities. What do you have? Where are you producing this stuff? Step number two, you need a timetable. How, when are we going to do this? We have seen none of that. And the main reason behind the way things went in Hanoi was that, well, basically the DPRK leader was presented with a list of capabilities that the United States had. They were taken by surprise. Basically, what they were hoping to get was easing of the sanctions regime in exchange for dismantling one particular site at Punggye that is, quite frankly, useless right now. They've detonated 6 nuclear weapons at the site. It's highly unstable. It cannot be used. So it's meaningless in terms of denuclearization. But of course, they were hoping that given the domestic issues that President Trump has been experiencing, they were hoping that he really needed a deal with Kim Jong-un. He gambled, he went all in, things didn't work out. When we say denuclearization, what the United States, the international community, the United Nations have in mind is different, I would say very different, from the North Korean view on denuclearization. When we say denuclearization, what we mean again is CVID, complete, verifiable, irreversible denuclearization of North Korea. The North Korean regime refers to the denuclearization of the entire Korean peninsula. What does that mean? Now, regrettably, the United States has also adopted somehow that language, denuclearization of the entire Korean peninsula. There haven't been nuclear weapons in South Korea since 1992. There used to be low-yield nuclear weapons meant to slow down the onslaught, the advance of the 1.2 million men and women in uniform who are basically deployed, poised to attack. Those nuclear weapons were withdrawn from South Korea. What the North Korean regime has in mind when it refers to the complete denuclearization of the Korean peninsula is the removal of South Korea from the protection of the US nuclear umbrella, which means basically the dissolution of the US-South Korea alliance, withdrawal of US forces Korea, which of course is a non-starter. I'm sure that many of you or all of you have been students of IR theory. If you were to look at the Korean peninsula from the perspective of an offensive realist, somebody like Professor Mersheimer at the University of Chicago, what I'm just about to say may sound preposterous, but I'm going to say it. The fundamental strategic objective of the Kim regime in North Korea is survival. I think we will all agree on that. And this regime has only one competitor, and that competitor is free, democratic, prosperous South Korea, Republic of Korea. The regime understands that for as long as that competitor exists, there can be no long-term guarantee of its survival. Why? Because the Korean people living in the north always have the alternative of reunification with South Korea under the Republic of Korea, under a democratic, prosperous market economy capitalist country. So as preposterous as that is going to sound, and you'll say, oh, come on, what are you talking about? South Korea, the world's 12th largest economy, versus North Korea, a minuscule size of the North Korean economy compared to South Korea. How can that be possible? But from the regime's perspective, they haven't yet given up on that fundamental strategic objective, and that doesn't boil down to North Korean tanks rolling down south. It boils down to increasing North Korean influence in the south. You have seen a very successful campaign to sanitize the image of the North Korean leader for more than a year now. If you said Kim Jong-un in late 2018, you thought of the leader sitting at the top of a system that is committing crimes against humanity. Well, regrettably, the regime is still committing crimes against humanity, but now he's somehow seen as a more or less enlightened leader who's meeting up with President Trump, meeting up with the South Korean president, the Russian president, the Chinese leader, and so on and so forth. So they've been extraordinarily successful at sanitizing that image. How has the regime managed to stay in place for so long? Well, the degree of coercion, control, surveillance, and punishment is absolutely overwhelming. North Korea has a population of 25 million people. There are 270,000 agents of 3 internal security agencies. The Ministry of State Security, the MSS, you can see this as perhaps the North Korean Gestapo, the secret police. They have 50,000 agents. The Ministry of Public Security, which is North Korea's police force, also executing political police functions, running one political prison camp, 210,000 agents. The Military Security Command, the MSC, whose mission is to keep an eye on officers, NCOs, those who matter in the military, 10,000 agents. There are truly 4 fundamental building blocks of the North Korean regime: the military, the Korean People's Army, the inner core of the Kim family, the internal security agencies that I have mentioned, and of course the party, the Korean Workers' Party. Which is the most important of these fundamental building blocks? Well, they're all important. If I were to pick one agency, that would be the Organization and Guidance Department, the OGD within the Korean Workers' Party. They're truly a human resources department on steroids. They make the appointments, they promote, they demote people, they decide who lives, who dies. By the way, of course, purges have always happened in North Korea. Kim Il-sung, the founder of the country, purged, for example, beginning in 1956, the pro-Chinese faction within the Korean Workers' Party, the pro-Russian faction. These purges have continued on Kim Jong-un's watch as well. They have actually been intensified. Why? Because his father had 20 years to prepare, 1974 to 1994. He barely had 3 years to prepare. His father was 53 years old when he became leader of North Korea. He was only 27. So he had to build a power base in a great rush. According to groups based in South Korea, including the Institute for National Security Strategy, INSS. This is an institute that employs a lot of North Korean escapees, senior defectors. Only during the first 5 years of the Kim Jong-un regime, 340 senior officials were executed, together with family members, colleagues, associates. All I have to tell you is that the favorite method of execution is execution by ZPU-4 anti-aircraft machine gun. You're talking 4 machine gun barrels, 14.5 millimeter caliber. I presume all of you, ladies and gents, come from metric systems. Their bodies are simply turned into pink mist. It's insane. So a good relationship between leaders is a good thing. It makes sense. If this is a one-man dictatorship, it's not a bad thing to know that President Trump has a good relationship with Kim Jong-un, but on the other hand, one has to remember who this man is. He had his own uncle, Chang Song-taek, the only son-in-law of Kim Il-sung, executed with an anti-aircraft machine gun. He had his own half-brother, Kim Jong-nam, assassinated with a weapon of mass destruction, VX nerve agent, at a busy international airport in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia in February 2017. So it is not Boy Scouts that we're dealing with here. This is very, very, very serious business. So by the way, I should have begun by telling you that I'm of course a US citizen now, but I was born and raised in communist Romania. So I've seen glimpses of the other sides of the world as well, and we all understand what we're dealing with here, basically. So what about the way forward? Where do we go from here? You may remember the Singapore summit. President Trump showed Kim Jong-un a very nice trailer, a movie basically presenting the North Korean leader with 2 alternatives. Denuclearize and the future will be bright. The South Koreans accomplished the miracle of the River Han. Over a period of only a few decades, they became a super highly developed country. Everybody likes South Korea, by the way. I spent a lot of time at the United Nations. I realized that honestly, I haven't come across countries that do not like South Korea, perhaps except for the DPRK, the North Korean brethren. So similarly, North Korea could have a very bright future if only they gave up this nuclear program. On the other hand, however, if you don't, well, the military option has always been on the table, is still on the table. Things could turn out pretty dicey. The truth is that economic development cannot come to North Korea without some other very important steps. Of course, denuclearization is very important. Of course, they must give up those nuclear weapons. Of course, they must give up the ballistic missile program. But on the other hand, how can one run a water and sanitation program next to a political prison camp? They must improve their human rights record. They must dismantle their unlawful detention facilities. And they need comprehensive economic, social, political reform. North Korea suffered a great famine in the 1990s. Up to 3 million people died. Ever since, informal markets have developed in North Korea. Many more people depend on these black or gray markets today than they did 20 or 30 years ago. And the problem is that there is no private property in North Korea. People do not hold property titles. Okay, you will read news stories and academic reports on the markets of North Korea. People driving trucks for profit, people driving taxis for profit, which is all true, but they do not own those vehicles. There are no property titles. They must be registered under government agencies. You need the protection of powerful government agencies and powerful individuals, which is a recipe for an extraordinary level of corruption. You will hear about the thriving real estate market of the capital city of Pyongyang. Differences between the capital city of Pyongyang and the rest of the country are just huge. This is not to say that life is great for everyone living in the capital city of Pyongyang. You're also talking about high-risers with no elevators, people who have running water only once every other week. They have to carry it up the stairs in buckets. So things can be pretty tough for people living in Pyongyang as well. But even though there are difficulties, the differences between the capital city of Pyongyang and the rest of the country are absolutely huge. So again, comprehensive social, economic, political reform. I was giving you the example of real estate in Pyongyang. Yes, there is money in North Korea, and people purchase these apartments for up to $200,000, which is a hefty amount of money anywhere in the world, especially in North Korea. They do not purchase property titles. What they purchase is the right to reside in these apartments. So if you were to look at the basics of international development, and I know that you're all fully aware of that, what would the DPRK have to do? Okay, so give up the nuclear weapons, give up the ballistic missiles, close down the political prison camps, absolutely. Accept international technical assistance to improve the human rights situation, but then, okay, let's say they need World Bank membership. Well, it's impossible to obtain World Bank membership if you're spending 30% of your GDP on your military. They would need to reduce military expenditure very drastically. You cannot join the World Bank unless you collect your national statistical data. They have had good technical assistance, in particular from the UN Population Fund. This only means that their demographers are now better at falsifying statistical data. They don't know it themselves. You must collect that data if you want to understand what the problems are. How are you going to help the most vulnerable if you don't have the capability to collect that data? And of course, they would have to learn how to work with international technical assistance. Not every international NGO or humanitarian agency is a bunch of spies. No, they actually go by internationally accepted standards as they do elsewhere in the world. Probably the ideal solution for the DPRK, should they take all these steps, would be IDA funding, International Development Agency funding. As you know, it's very low interest or no interest, phased out over a very long period of time. Of course, there are conditions. Conditionality is a big part of this, so the bottom line is that they would need, again, fundamental, comprehensive economic, social, political reform.